we are given the equation 3 times the square root of 5 minus 9 times 7i. So let's begin working on this equation with knowing the order of operations. So we're going to first start with defining the variables, or the constants inside the expression of our square root here. So 5 minus 9 equals negative 4. So this is going to give us the square root of negative 4 times 3 times 7i. So at this point, it looks a little bit difficult because we don't know what the square root of negative 4 is. In fact, it's impossible to have a square root of a negative number. So it's tempting to say that this equation has no solution. But if we can look at the square root of a negative number in the viewpoint of complex numbers. And complex numbers allow us to define imaginary numbers that don't exist, which still allows us to work with them and find real solutions when there seems to not be one, like in this case. So we can say that the square root of negative 1 equals I. So we cannot take the square root of a negative number, but we can represent the square root of negative 1 as a variable, or as an imaginary number, I. I is not a variable. I represents a constant that doesn't exist. So with this information, we're going to look back at our square root of negative 4. So the square root of negative 4 can also be written as the square root of 4i, because we're taking out the square root of a negative 1 here, and we're representing that as I. So now we have the square root of 4 times 3 times 7i. And we can solve for the square root of 4. And the square root of 4 is 2. So now we have 2i times 3 times 7i. So if we multiply 3 times 2, we get 6. So 6i times 7i. And now we can multiply 6i times 7i. And what we will get is 42 times I squared. Remember, we have 2 of these. Now, if we look back at and see what I represents, it represents the square root of negative 1. And because we're squaring it, that means that we are saying the square root of negative 1 squared. And if we remember how square roots work, is whenever we multiply a square root by itself, we get the number that is inside the square root. So this is saying the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1, which equals 1, because the square cancels out our square root, and we're left with the number negative 1. So because we're doing that here with 42 times I squared, we're really saying is 42 times negative 1, which equals negative 42. So we can say that our solution to 3 times the square root of 5 minus 9 times 7i equals negative 42.